Welcome to the third of our webinar series. This is the session on planning for a successful migration into Microsoft 365. So we've had two previous sessions talking about our maturity model, evaluating where you are from a Microsoft 365 point of view. And going through that process, you may find that while you may be partially in Microsoft 365, full adoption does require a broader migration into that. That's really what this session is about, is to take us through what that migration journey can look like. So a quick agenda that we're going to cover off here. We're going to do intros on myself and Eric, who's going to be co-presenting. We'll do a brief recap on the series so far, and then we'll dive right into the migration process. And a key part of that is not just doing the actual migration, but also doing change management and adoption to make sure that that's successful. We do have the Q&A open on the GoToWebinar, so if you've got questions we're going through, feel free to ask. May not see that as we're speaking, but we'll take pauses, look at that, and answer questions as we go through there. So let's start with intros. I'm Peter Carson, President of Envision IT and Office Apps and Services MVP. Contact details are up in here. We're going to be sharing this deck up on our event page. So we'll send a link out to everybody after the webinar with the link to the page. You can download the presentation, and then shortly after we should have the recording up there as well for folks who weren't able to join us live through here. Eric, why don't I flip it over to you to do an introduction on yourself?
Thanks, Peter. Hi, everybody. Great to be here. Great to be with everybody. Hopefully, I can even be heard, which is an extra special bonus for today's webinar. As mentioned, my name is Eric Riz. I'm a principal consultant here with Envision. I'm a 6-time Office Apps and Services MVP. These days, really, everything is focused so much on Microsoft 365 and how we've built out our maturity model. I'm doing so much in the Microsoft team space, specifically in the areas of strategy and governance. And it's been great over the past few weeks to watch how this conversation around the maturity model has really grown, and looking forward to today's discussion as well. So thank you.
Cool, thanks, Eric. So if you've tuned into our previous series, we do have the recordings and decks up on our site as well if you didn't get a chance to, but we've broken out what we've called the Envision IT Microsoft 365 maturity model. And it's really going from an informal, where maybe it's deployed, but people aren't necessarily leveraging it to any certain degree, all the way up to optimize, that you're really optimizing that experience. Now, Microsoft 365 is a very broad suite. We're not trying to capture all of that. We're really focused in on certain workloads in there. Obviously, Teams being the key one today with COVID and the remote work still being the norm for most people. Teams is often a big part of that. So how is that being used in your organization? You can't really talk about Teams without SharePoint, because document collaboration within Teams all happens in SharePoint Online under the hood. So people may not be aware of that, but it is there and part of it, as is OneDrive. Outlook, email is obviously part as well. Maybe lesser known, Stream from a video recording point of view, so being able to record meetings like this one and play them back later. OneNote from an ad hoc note sharing point of view. It's not just a personal tool, it's one that you can share across team members, and Planner and To Do from a group as well as individual task management point of view. So those are really the ones that we fit in through there. And I'm not going to go through the full details on these slides. We covered them in the previous sessions, but we did talk about briefly this idea that Microsoft gives you a lot of choice. There's a lot of different tools available in the 365 stack, and there's often overlap between them. If we take the first scenario here of sending and receiving information, you could choose to do that through email, through chats in Teams, through channel conversations. There's a number of different ways of doing that. Really, that's what the maturity model is about, is measuring that and then encouraging the desired behavior within your organization of what that should look like. So we're still working through what the maturity model actually looks like, from an informal to an optimized. What we have in here right now is more focused on the level of usage within your organization. What we're moving towards, though, is not just whether people are using it, but how they're using it. So we take Teams, for example. One of our key metrics in the maturity model that we're working on is looking at how people are communicating through Teams. Are they doing one-to-one chat conversations? Are they actually using Teams and channels and having persistent channel conversations that you can have serendipitous people drop into that conversation, be able to leverage the knowledge that's in there? That's where you really start to get the power through that. And that applies to all these tools. So we're working with clients to kind of flesh out this model, build out both tools that we can use to analyze on a tenant, as well as survey tools that we shared in the last webinar to be able to self-assess from that point of view. So I'm going to switch though right into the details of what we want to talk about today, which is actually doing a migration into Microsoft 365. And like I said at the beginning, I mean, you found that your organization has already done some or a great deal of this, but as you dig deeper into how people are actually using 365, you may find that that migration is still very much in flight, and things need to happen from there. I mean, there's often an Exchange migration as part of that. That's often one of the first things that happens. Exchange is fairly transparent to users. They don't really notice that their mailbox is in the cloud when it used to be an on-premise Exchange server, unless they happen to go into Outlook Web Access. It's very transparent. But as we get into SharePoint on-premises, file shares on-premises, moving that into SharePoint Online, OneDrive for Business, exposing that through Teams, that obviously has a much bigger impact on user experience and something you need to manage from a change management point of view. So if we look at the steps through there, while I said Exchange is where you generally start with a mailbox migration, often what's overlooked is really looking deeper at the security side as well. What shape is your Active Directory in? Azure AD and Azure AD Connect, that's a very important piece of the Microsoft 365 puzzle, making sure that that's all appropriate through that. And there may be some changes, things like multi-factor authentication, we'll talk about in a minute, to greatly improve the security of your Microsoft 365, and that does have an impact on user experience. So change management needs to start early, educating people about what's happening and what's coming, what does it mean to them, how does it change the way that they work, and why is that good to both them and to the organization. And then moving to the right into the SharePoint and Teams side of things, Teams may have been thrust onto the organization, but there may not be a lot of deeper adoption in terms of getting into Teams and channels and what that looks like. So we'll talk more about that side as well. So I won't spend a lot of time. I did a webinar series back in March when COVID first hit, and the first session of that was a deeper dive into the security side. But I do want to touch on it because it's a really important part of the migration story, is making sure that your underlying infrastructure is in good shape and you're well positioned from that point of view. Because what happens in any 365 implementation, it depends on Azure Active Directory in the cloud as its authentication store. And typically what we see in most mid and enterprise organizations is that's synchronized through Azure AD Connect with your on-premises Active Directory. So as you create an on-premise AD through your onboarding process, you have staff leaving the organization and you offboard them and remove them or deactivate the on-premise directory. Azure AD Connect keeps that sync up in the cloud. Users come in Microsoft 365, they do that through Azure AD. And that may happen in a number of ways. You might back to your on-premise single sign-on, password sync. I mean, I won't get into those details here, but they're part of the conversation to ensure that that's appropriate through there. What's important to think about is how you set up and secure your Azure Active Directory. These are some stats from a Microsoft presentation in the 2020 are the global well-renowned security conference, and they were sharing what they were seeing in Azure Active Directory, not just for Microsoft, but kind of across the stack. And remember, these are massive numbers. I mean, there's billions of Azure AD accounts around the world. But you see a large number, 0.2 million compromised accounts in January 2020. So this is happening. This is real, and this is something that you need to think about. One of the messages was that 99% of those compromised accounts did not use multi-factor authentication. If you're not familiar with MFA, it's basically something you have plus something you know. So the something you know is your password, but you need something else, like the typical one is an authenticator app on your mobile device that prompts you for a second factor authentication. It could be a phone call. Those are actually not super strong ways of doing it. I'm a big fan using the authenticator. But the big learning here is if you're not using MFA, you should be, because it's got a huge impact on your security profile. And the other big one was that legacy authentication, so old applications that don't support MFA, obviously have a big impact from compromises as well. So you can put in what are called conditional access policies and lock that down so that you're not able to do legacy authentication. You got to mitigate. You may have some legacy apps that you got to take care of as part of that, and that can be a blocker in the project. But best to learn about those early and figure out a mitigation strategy for that. So I won't go through all the points in here, but the top two I want to raise. You set up multi-factor authentication is very important. Number two, though, is training your users. And this comes back to the change management and adoption side of things. One of the weakest links in security is often the users themselves. We look at the big high-profile Twitter hack that happened with huge name accounts like Bill Gates and Barack Obama getting access to their Twitter accounts compromised. That was actually done through social engineering. So hackers actually targeted people who worked at Twitter, did some social engineering with them, compromised their accounts, and used those to leapfrog into the high-profile accounts. And that's a common scenario. So training your users to look out for things like phishing attacks and such are really important as part of your change management plan. Okay, so let's talk about the SharePoint Online migration. I'm going to leave the Exchange Online piece. That's pretty straightforward. We'll assume that mailbox migration can happen. We can go deeper into that in another session. But I want to focus in on how do you get your document collaboration moved into Microsoft 365. Well, there's a number of steps you're going to go through in this process, and it may not be one pass through. It may be multiple iterations through this. I mean, it starts with inventorying what you have. Where do you have documents today? Are they in file shares? Are they in on-premise SharePoint? Some of our clients are doing consolidations. It may even be other Microsoft 365 tenants. Because you have to understand what you have first, and then start planning out your information architecture. What should the structure of that look like in 365? And then going through the migration, the launch of that, and the adoption around that. And through that whole process, again, change management is really important. You got to let people know what's coming, why you're doing this, why are they being asked to participate in things like inventory exercises and ownership identification and information architecture planning. It's really key that they're engaged in part of that process. So that inventory can take a number of forms. I mean, I've written a blog article on how you can do it from a file share migration point of view. We have PowerShell scripts that you can inventory your file shares. We actually have the same from an on-premise SharePoint point of view, as well as even a SharePoint Online perspective. My plan is to put some other posts up to share that as well. But really the idea is gather detailed document level metadata and information into Excel and use that to start to analyze it. Because you're going to find that there's duplicate content in there, there's redundant stuff you want to archive that should just get deleted from a retention point of view. And as much of that you can tidy up and take care of as part of the inventory process before you start your migration, the better. And we actually use Power BI. We've got a number of dashboards we've created to make it easy to kind of slice and dice through that data and start to make some of those decisions. And then coming out of that inventory, you're going to start building out your information architecture. What is the site structure going to look like in Microsoft 365 that we're going to put these documents into? Even if you're coming from an on-premises SharePoint, odds are you're not using a modern information architecture in there. You've got subsites and sub-subsites. You really need to flatten that out into site collections, because that's the modern style that fits much better in with how Teams is designed to be used. I mean, we still use hub sites to group sites together from a navigation, branding, search point of view, but really having that flat structure is going to be a big part of it. Because if we think about SharePoint, this used to be a SharePoint only slide that we would use to explain the difference between OneDrive for Business that was private by default versus team sites, which is where your collaboration happens, versus communication sites, which are your publishing sites, your staff portal, your intranet, for example. But we really need to layer Teams in on top of that to say, okay, when I'm chatting one-to-one with people, that's very much, from a document point of view, those documents by default are going to end up in my OneDrive for Business. Versus when I'm doing channel conversations in a team and in a channel, that's going to live within team sites. So understanding that relationship is key to part of the information architecture planning that you're going to go through. So if you're coming from an on-premise SharePoint point of view, you're going to have that deep sub-site structure. You may only have one site collection. That's not uncommon to see in an on-premises SharePoint with deep levels of sub-sites underneath that. While you could just forklift it into SharePoint Online, that's not really our recommended approach. We want to go through an exercise to say, hey, let's flatten that into site collections, organize it under hub sites, and think about how Teams plays into that as well. You shouldn't be having a conversation just about SharePoint document management without thinking about Teams. So as we're talking about information architecture, we take what we call a Teams first approach to that. And that starts with two big questions to the organization, which is what does a team represent and what does a channel represent? I don't mean from a technology, what does Microsoft think they represent? What do they actually mean in your organization? So if we take Envision IT, for example, I mean, we are a consulting organization. We do projects for clients. I mean, that's the bulk of our delivery work. So we have, your typical department level teams, and they can have channels for sub-departments and things like that. Through that, we see that in all organizations. But what we've decided is that we're going to make teams from a delivery point of view represent our clients, and channels represent our projects. And that works really well. We've got one place to go, whoever's working with that client is part of that team. And projects are organized so that we can see if we've got multiple projects going on or historical projects. We don't get confused from a conversation point of view, but also from a documentation point of view, all those documents live in that projects folder for that channel. So it works quite well for us. I mean, we've got a consulting engineering company where they're doing large infrastructure projects. To them, teams represent locations and channels represent projects within those locations. So very similar sort of ideas. But you might decide, you know what, our projects are so big or our initiatives are so big, we want to have a dedicated team just for that project, and maybe channels represent phases to that project. So you have to have a conversation and really socialize this through your organization and understand what this looks like. And it may not be a one size fits all, but it's good to talk about it and see if you can consolidate that as best as you can. And once you've answered that from a team's point of view, then you can dig deeper into saying, okay, well, what, do we still use subfolders? Do we want to use document sets and metadata? What does that look like from there? I mean, if you're not familiar with the document set concept, let me just switch over to a quick live demo here to give you a sense. So here I'm in our Envision IT marketing site collection, and there's a team behind that. We've got channels and folders for documents in that. But what we've done here is we've actually created a separate document library specific to events like this webinar that we run. And basically, we create a document set for each webinar that we're doing. So I can come into here to this series itself, and I can see the actual documents related to this series. And we can see metadata that comes through from here. So we track things like what's the event date, what type of event it is at the document set level, and then all the documents that we drop in there inherit that metadata. And we can see here that we've got specific documents like a presentation that we've applied an additional set of metadata around document type to that. So if I come back out to the top level folder, I can actually flip my views around and say, hey, I'm not interested in seeing it at that folder view. I want to take the folders off, and I can start to do some interesting things there. So now it's showing me all documents across all events. And if I want to start to filter that and say, hey, I'm looking for particular document types, so I can pick the filter by in here and say, hey, I'm actually looking for presentation from a past event. I'm going to go ahead and apply that. Now all the other documents have gone away. I don't see them in folders, so I'm not going from folder A, B, C, searching for that thing. I can see them all here. I can sort them by the event date, say, hey, I want the newest ones up at the top through here. And we actually see the recent ones through here. In fact, here's my event here. Now it's tagged for an event date for when the series started, but that's actually today's session that we've got going on through here. Or actually, no, I don't. I'm in the wrong library. Never mind. Demo gods are not shining on me. But you get the idea. I mean, that document sets and metadata build on top of the information architecture that you've built through the team side of things. So let's flip over and step away from the SharePoint migration for a second and talk about Teams provisioning. If you've tuned into my webinars in the past, this is a topic I speak about a lot. We've created an open source solution around Azure Logic Apps, SharePoint, PowerShell, Azure Automation to allow people to basically request a new team, specify certain attributes of it, submit it, and it may or may not go through an approval process, and then it gets created in a standardized way. What we're encouraging our clients to do is even if you don't choose to use our solution, have some sort of process and some sort of template in process before you start the migration process. So that when we come to the actual migration, we talked about the inventory and planning, where we're doing the information architecture. What we want to do next is don't just copy those sites and sub-sites over into your SharePoint Online, but actually provision out your new structure. What does your team look like? How is it organized? What sort of template do you have to it? And then go through a mapping process, because you basically need to flatten that structure that you have in your legacy SharePoint or even in your file share system into this modern structure that we're going to have in Microsoft 365. We're a big fan of ShareGate, so we encourage using ShareGate as a tool to do that migration process. Do your QA, make sure it looks good, engage your users to do some user acceptance testing, and then launch that out and drive your adoption from there. Now, this doesn't need to be a big bang. It can be an individual process. We're actually going through this with one of our clients right now. They're a family office for high net worth families. So they've got several hundred families that they do the back office for from an investment management point of view. And we're not going to try and lift all of those together. We're saying, okay, let's do an inventory and planning on half a dozen families, for example, provision out the team structure through that. We've actually automated some of the migration mapping to simplify that, because they've got a very rich metadata structure that they want to implement as part of that coming out of the file shares. We're using ShareGate to do the migration, involving them in the UAT, launching that out, and then repeating that for the next set of families. Now, it's going to take 6 months or so probably to get through that full process, but it's important to take your time, make sure the adoption is happening properly, that things aren't falling through the cracks there, and things are getting organized properly as we do that. And there's the chance there that maybe we didn't get the exact right structure that we wanted there, and we want to tweak it. That can become part of the process going forward from there. So it's important to think about how do you align what you had previously, whether that was in file share folder structure or in SharePoint on premises, and what does that look like in the modern Teams and SharePoint Online world. You may not choose to use ShareGate, but it's kind of our preferred one. It works really well from that point of view. And this is a good time to evaluate your content. Can you do some pruning, deleting, archive? Does it all need to come across through there? I mean, that can overwhelm as well, so there's a balance. You don't want to derail it because you get paralyzed by trying to clean up. So strike the right balance from that point of view. So there's some other things we do as well. We use a tool called SBDocKit. It's a commercial tool. You can buy a copy yourself. And it basically inventories your farm infrastructure if you're running SharePoint on-premise. We want to look for any custom solutions in there, any gotchas from that point of view. We're going to generate a number of reports to guide you through the process. And if you look at this triangle here, the folders and files, whether they're file shares or just documents in libraries in SharePoint, that's pretty easy. It's a low effort to migrate that across. As we start to get into workflows and specific features, some of that needs to be transformed. Yes, you can still do SharePoint Designer workflows. You may not be aware, but you can still do SharePoint 2010 Designer workflows in SharePoint Online. That feature is getting turned off in October of this year, so there's actually a looming deadline from that point of view. So you got to do some transformation from that perspective. As you get into custom solutions, you got to think about removing or rewriting those. So those can become very high. Maybe you want to leave those to later in the process. Maybe there's some simplification that can happen as part of that. So that's all part of the planning process, is to identify that and figure out how you're going to mitigate through that. So going through those steps and tools from there. I mentioned ShareGate several times. There's also a free tool from Microsoft called the SharePoint Migration Tool. We find the ShareGate's a little more robust, works better from our point of view. But by all means, if you're interested, check out the free tool. There's other vendor tools out there. AvePoint, Metalogics are some of the names that jump to mind. Honestly, we don't have a lot of experience with that, so I can't speak too well to them. our attention is primarily being on the ShareGate side. And some of the things that it provides, as well as doing the migration, it provides a number of reports that, things like this checked out documents report, big gotcha in migrations. If people have stuff checked out in the on-premises SharePoint, those current versions are not going to get caught as part of the migration, and they're going to get missed. So, it's important to go through these reports. I won't go through in detail, but I'll save them for the PowerPoint deck. You can have a look to see what some of the things you'd be looking for through that. So, we've already talked about this model through here. It may not be a one-shot through. It may be a rinse and repeat process that you go through there, but that's really how it works. That we do the inventory and planning. We want to really provision the structure that's our go-forward structure in Microsoft 365 first, and then figure out how to get the current information into that structure. Do the appropriate testing through that, launch it, and then repeat as necessary through that. Now, through this entire process, adoption is not just at the end. Change management is something you need to do through the entire process. So, Eric, why don't I turn it over to you to talk about the change management and adoption side?
Thanks, Peter. Now, as we look at these slides, really from the get-go, there's so much to be said around change management. Now, for many people, change management is something that provokes a lot of fear. It's something that people really aren't comfortable with. There's recognition of change anywhere in the organization is not always something that's comfortable, and particularly when people don't have the access to information and content, as well as the foresight or the knowledge that they need to really get their jobs done, that can really provoke a lot of fear, a lot of concern, and studies have shown that that's exactly where in the technology migration world, your readiness and your maturity and your usage will start to fail. If people don't know where their content is, they certainly can't get their jobs done. So to start off in the change and adoption conversation, you want to make sure that you're talking about focus, and that focus needs to begin with focusing on departmental success, which means asking sometimes difficult questions, which are going to lead to answers that are going to be incorporated in a change management plan, and then further adoption as you move forward with your project and your migration. So understanding what the department needs, understanding what it is that those individuals and those users need to really get their job done is going to be a critical question, and will be critical questions to ask as you begin to move forward. Transitioning, transformation are obviously things that are going to be part of your change management journey, and ensuring that people recognize how change will happen in the organization is certainly critical to that conversation. One of the strategies that can be used, that we certainly use with our customers, is piloting. Piloting, of course, is taking a subset of your user community and creating customization or creating a rollout plan that's going to feature the best sort of low-hanging fruit, if you will, technology and the best strategy for that specific user set to succeed. Piloting there will ensure that the organization has sort of self-generated subject matter expertise, because the people who use the products first and see how the migration has worked and how they will be affected, they become subject matter experts in the organization, and they'll be sure to work with others in the organization to ensure that there is long-term success for the entire company. And that's certainly something that we're looking for here, is bringing those SMEs into the forefront in order to share content and share information with their peers. Going back to Envision IT's Microsoft 365 maturity model, there's a lot of conversation in the maturity circles, in the use case circles, around how the Microsoft 365 suite will suit me as an individual, as a person, as a user. And when you speak to migration and you speak to planning, certainly there's a lot to be considered, and it's important that the conversation is held internally to ensure that people understand not just, as I mentioned earlier, how change management is going to affect the organization, but how it's really going to affect people on a one-to-one basis. There's a lot to be included. There's a lot to be said at a process level within Microsoft 365, and we want to make sure that everybody is geared towards success. So looking at this slide, which is our friend Justin here, who's a program manager with the US Air Force, you can see as you go through the various times in the day that Justin's day is really focused on collaboration. The example, the day in the life guide that you're looking at is something that you can download yourself off the Microsoft website. We can't take any credit here to the imagery or the graphics that you're seeing on this particular slide, but it focuses on a number of things that are critical to long-term change management and long-term success. Things like how Justin starts his day at 7 a.m. That's really focused on using the Microsoft app, and it standardizes him for how he uses internal and external mail and conversations. For the Outlook usage itself, looking at the Outlook buttons, he's using the Outlook buttons to share information across, not just from Exchange, from Outlook or from his activity feed, but he's using it to exchange content information across into OneNote. And that, as a collaborative feature, is something that's very important. It shows that you have the principles in place to understand where content is created and where content is used throughout the organization. Now, the only reason why he would be using that particular button to change, to ensure that the meeting notes are being taken in OneNote, is if others in the organization are certain that that they're using it as well, meaning you have a single source of content, you're creating information once, you're using it multiple times, and obviously OneNote provides that the facility in order to do that. When he uses the other examples, you can see that when Justin uses the chat, the channel conversations, the messaging features of Teams, you can see that all the communication that he does is standardized, which means he knows how to communicate, and more importantly, people know where to look for the communication. So if he mentions somebody, as you can see in many of the examples, then he knows that he's essentially sending a call out to somebody else in the organization, and that's something very important that the other individual knows, that when that call out happens, that they have to go to a particular place in order to find the message and then action as they move forward. And then as he goes through the rest of his day, when you look at Justin, you can see that there's a lot of governance and compliance policies that have been created along the way through Excel, through other workloads and apps that he's using in order to ensure that all of the information, the content, the structure is maintained internally. So from a change perspective, a lot of this may be new to the organization, but structurally, it's all content that makes a lot of sense. It's all content that people can really get their arms and hands around, and it's what really creates something that I like to call the authentic workplace, where there's a lot of transparency involved. Everybody knows where the policies sit and lie, and really they know how to get their job done. And that's obviously what's most important here. As you look to the next slide, which is again focused back on the maturity model, the maturity model itself, as Peter mentioned off the top, walks through the conversation from an optimized solution, which is your best case in terms of how organizations will use the Microsoft 365 suite. And that, of course, starts off, you have to start somewhere. That starts off with informal. Informal on this particular slide shows top-down how organizations are going to use the Microsoft 365 suite. So with Teams, if you're using it informally, there's general functional use in a particular department. That could be your pilot, looking at the migration conversation. And as you look through the other workloads, you look at Stream, you see how Stream is being used. SharePoint, of course, is a huge conversation. Understanding what OneDrive is going to do and how files are going to be synchronized with or without user knowledge, as I like to say. And then, as we mentioned with Justin, you have OneNote and how OneNote is operating at an organizational level. And OneNote, as the example, you can see on that particular slide how that conversation grows through the maturity model. You see how it grows into structured note-taking, how notebooks are shared, into proactivity, if you will, and how OneNote files are shared through and from teams at an organizational level. These are all things that out of the box OneNote can do and the Microsoft 365 suite can do, but understanding what the growth path is and understanding how your organization can actually use these workloads and use this content for the better and to map through the organization is truly important. As you look to the next slide, you can see that what we do is we create this critical rules of engagement. These are slides that we start with or content that we start with to really gauge and set people for success. So looking at things like your activity feed becoming your new inbox, recognizing that that content is going to come only from internal sources, through to the last item on that slide that shows how Teams is really the launch pad for all Office 365 applications. Lots of content and concepts on that slide that we really want people to understand and to work through. Another thing that we do with the change conversation is we show what and how, in terms of recommendations, we're going to use the tools. So here's a top 10 list, for example, of how we show things you should do and want to do with Microsoft Teams, starting with chat, ensuring that everybody knows how to chat. They recognize that chat is really a one-to-one or one-to-many conversation that's not contextualized. It can't be found afterwards in terms of a particular project channel, but it's information that is done between two people, much like a text message, all the way through to helping number 10, fostering active channels, ensuring that people are active in channels, as well as teams, highlighting posts, ensuring that the channel and or the team is app mentioned in order to share information, which of course today is something that's very important from an organizational perspective. We really want to make sure that people recognize what that is. Now on the maturity path, on the next slide, you'll see that we've created a Microsoft 365 maturity survey, which is how we get you started on the maturity path. You can hit that through the bit.ly link, and by all means, please fill that out. And this is what we really use to have conversations with customers from the get-go on the maturity growth scale in order to understand what they're currently doing around the Microsoft 365 suite, how they're communicating, through to what their documents, what their information management looks like in order to get them on a path to success. And this is completely response agnostic. It doesn't matter how you're doing. It doesn't matter if you're doing amazing or just starting off. What we want to do is start the conversation and have the information move forward. Peter just sent the link in the chat as well, which you can see. Also, ensuring that training is available to the organization is very important. Recognizing that there is a ton of content that's available right now in terms of training, in terms of learning pathways, which you'll see on the next slide, really ensures that people are using the tools to the best of their capability. And if you look at that, the next slide 2 down, you'll see that Learning Pathways, there's a Learning Pathways screen. Learning Pathways is really a collection of Microsoft training videos and help scenarios, use case scenarios, which will allow organizations to set themselves on a growth path for success. It can also be customized. This is the Teams example of what Learning Pathways looks like, which can be customized in order to create more custom content for specific users, specific user groups, and of course, all focused on the growth path and to ensure that everyone is moving forward. The next few slides speak to the productivity score. This is something that is really generated through a lot of the Microsoft 365 analytics that come out of box, which you have access to already. You can also leverage some partner content. We have a tightly linked partnership with tyGraph, and you'll see some of the tyGraph content on the next slides that really shows how information is being used from an analytic perspective. So who's using email, who's using OneDrive, where are our SharePoint files, how many of those files are actively being touched, how are people doing individually from a chat versus channel perspective when sending messages, receiving messages. All of this content can be, is actually computed for you, and you just need to go into the admin panel within each of those workloads and access those analytics, understand, and path your own way to success, sort of post-migration. It can also be done pre-migration to understand where you are today and use it as a a feel-good type of document or report post-migration, but regardless, leveraging those analytics is something that's very important. On the next slide, you'll see some of the out-of-box analytics and versus the tyGraph analytics, which shows what you can use and leverage in those admin consoles, as I mentioned earlier, as well as some of the tyGraph features, such as tyGraph Pulse, in order to provide more detailed analytics at a Microsoft 365 level across the organization.
And Eric, probably the other thing to mention on the tyGraph side is the retention of those analytics as well is probably a key feature for a lot of folks. On standard Office 365 plans as you move into an E5 with retention on it. tyGraph basically harvests not just that analytics data, but much deeper audit and analytics data, and basically archives that for things you want and makes that available through these Power BI dashboards from here.
Absolutely. Our next slide goes back to the resources. These slides will be available to you following the conversation today, which will wrap up in just a few minutes. Links there to the webinars that we've presented within this series, as well as a link to our website there at the bottom. And the image on the right is really about structural success, not about pulling the wrong block and making it all fall over. I just want to be very clear there.
Very good.
Peter, do you want to take us home on our last couple slides?
Yeah, why don't I take it from there? Thanks, Eric. Just recapping back to the teams and site provisioning side of things. So we see this as a key part of the strategy. It doesn't have to be our open source approach, but understanding how you want to use Teams in your organization. And you may say, well, we already use Teams. You know, we're all working remotely through COVID, and we're doing chats and web meetings all the time, but that doesn't mean you're really leveraging Teams. So figure out what your end state should be, what that structure should look like, and make sure that you make that part of your migration plan, that it is a Teams first migration, get you off the file shares, get you off of the legacy on-premises SharePoint from there. Now on that theme, we've got a couple of things from an upcoming events point of view. We don't have it up on our site just yet. We're actually just working with a newly launched organization. Mike Paseric, I know well through the Office Apps and Services MVP program that he's been part of in the past. And he's launched a company called Orchestry, which is all about the governance and the provisioning side of Teams. We're actually going to do a webinar on September 23rd. He and I, similar to the one, if you tuned in, that I did with Ben Nyland from ShareGate a month or so ago, just kind of chatting back and forth on what organizations should be thinking about from a Teams governance, from a provisioning point of view. And we'll talk more about, you know, how we see our solution complementing, fitting in with what Orchestry's done, and how you can have a great combination through there. If you'd like to learn more about the maturity model side that Eric was talking about, Eric's published up his calendar link on the page here, and this link will be live in the presentation we're going to post up on the site as well, so you can see slots available for him. Feel free to book a meeting to talk more about that and what that could look like through there. Look at that, we're right at the 12:45 mark, right on time. Apologies about the missteps at the beginning. Hope that was a good, useful session for you to understand, even if you're already partially in Microsoft 365, kind of how do you step back now that maybe the dust has settled a little on the remote working, figure out how the full migration and how you fully leverage what Microsoft's bringing out fast and furiously from a modern collaboration point of view, and really leverage that in your organization. So from there, I want to thank you for your time and have a great rest of your day.